Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's subject is finding the real value in your vulnerability data. But before I dive into that, I just want to take a minute and say thank you. I appreciate the time that you take out of your day to listen to each episode. I hope it brings you value, and I appreciate your comments and feedback. Now, let's dive into today's topic. So today I'm talking about vulnerability data, and I know that for some, this can be a real sore subject because it's overwhelming, and I understand that. What I'm going to give you today is something that you can start using to help making your vulnerability data, switching it from something that's kind of a pain to deal with, and instead finding the gold nuggets that are buried inside this data. So let's talk about that for a minute. In episode 1, we talked about how to make better risk-based decisions. And then in episode 2, we talked about how to go from theory to implementation. Now I'm taking that a step further, and we're talking about the vulnerability data, which is really at the core of your risk management program. So for most organizations, everything revolves around the vulnerabilities, how many you have, how many you're working on each day, what your progress is you're making. And what I'm going to suggest, what I'm going to challenge is that you're probably not leveraging that data. So your biggest risk, your biggest fear, all of us have this fear, is a cyber attack. So when you're looking at your vulnerability data, are you really asking the question, how do all these vulnerabilities relate to a cyber attack? What I'm going to suggest is, if you haven't found it yet, take a look at the MITRE ATT&CK model. Now, the MITRE ATT&CK model is an organization-supported framework, structure, a massive list of attack tactics and techniques. And there are different baselines for the MITRE ATT&CK. There's an enterprise one. There's also one for artificial intelligence. So there are several in here, but let's just focus right now on the enterprise one. That's the most common one. And what MITRE does, people constantly contribute and update this, but it says, okay, here is the attack life cycle, from beginning all the way to final execution. And what are the things that the techniques, the how of attackers executing an attack step by step by step, right? And so basically the first two steps are initial access and privilege escalation. So my challenge to you is, when you are managing your vulnerability data and you are prioritizing that effort and you're assigning resources and you're trending this, are you able to identify how your vulnerability data, how each individual vulnerability relates to the attack sequence? If you're not doing that, then I guarantee you're not getting the most out of your vulnerability data. And I can hear some of you already saying, hey, Charlene, this is too much effort. How am I going to get this work done? And I have all this other stuff that I have to do. I have all these vulnerabilities I have to patch. I'm trying to manage my risk. And I understand that it's overwhelming. And that's why I had to do this work myself. So believe me, I understand. That's why I'm going to give you, in this episode, I'm going to explain to you how you can do this. And it really is not that hard. I have done this myself for years, so I can speak from real experience. What you do is you focus in on the detailed description of each vulnerability, because it turns out whenever the vendor finds the vulnerability and they get ready to report it, they have to write up this description. What does this vulnerability do? How is it leveraged? They don't always give you all the details, but they do describe it in sufficient terms for people to be able to understand what the risk is, right? How is this compromised? The how of the vulnerability being leveraged, and what is it the vulnerability is being affected, right? Is it a memory buffer? Is it a code execution? Is it something that exposes information about the system or the application, right? in those descriptions, there are keywords, and those keywords can be aligned to the MITRE ATT&CK model, to those steps in the attack sequence. And so all you really have to do, and you can do this today, in fact, you already have the tools you need to do this, and you already have the data. You just need to understand that you can do this. So let me explain how this works. And I have a spreadsheet, and this is one of the ways that I teach vulnerability analysis. And so what you're going to do in your spreadsheet is, and you can use other things, like if you have Power BI, you can use the query language in that. You can use other tools to do this, but a spreadsheet is what I use because it's simple, it's basic, most people already know this, so you don't have to buy something extra, you don't have to spend any additional money. All it really takes is a few hours, just a few hours, and you'll be able to reproduce this and do this multiple times. And once you set this up, then every time you go back and do it, you're just kind of washing the data through this tool, and it just becomes easier and quicker every time that you do it, until it almost becomes automatic. You load the data, you get the results, and you're done. And so what you're doing is you're identifying for your environment what those keywords are. For example, I'm going to focus on initial access and privilege escalation because these are really the first two steps that the environments experience, and where you will have vulnerabilities that are identifiable to these two stages. And if I can identify these first two, then I can stop lateral movement because they can't get in, right? So you could match your vulnerability data to all of the steps in the attack lifecycle, and that might be very interesting. But I tend to focus on just the first two, because if I can eliminate those, it's like closing all the doors and windows in the castle. They can't get in, right? And so that's kind of my focus, because again, I'm trying to eliminate the probability or minimize the probability that a cyber attack can occur, and I'm going to focus on those first two stages. So all I'm going to do is, in my vulnerability data, I'm going to use a little formula in Excel that looks at that data string, which is the description, and it's going to look for certain keywords. And I'll do this for each keyword. And I tend to lay this out in a spreadsheet, and then each keyword has its own column, and I kind of tag them, and then I can aggregate the results at the end. And it's really pretty basic. It's really very basic to set up. And so I go through all my vulnerabilities, and I look for things like remote code execution or code execution, code injection, cross-site scripting. There are all these phrases that we use to describe these kinds of vulnerabilities, and those keywords, when you tag your data this way, generally will find 85% of all these types of vulnerabilities. There are very few vulnerabilities that get published for which the vendors don't really do a good job in describing in the description that that vulnerability can lead to initial access, that it allows some sort of code execution. So most vendors are really very good, and like I said, I've done this for a number of years. I have probably analyzed billions of lines of vulnerabilities, and so I can speak with a high level of confidence that this very simple method is extremely effective. And then each time, each month, there are new vulnerabilities. I just load them back up again, and I go through, and then I can quickly identify. So what's really also very useful about this is you can not only look at initial access and privilege escalations, you can look at the whole life cycle, right? Or I could pull other statistics out of my vulnerability data. I could, for example, look at vendors, in which case my keyword might be Microsoft, Adobe, Cisco, or I might look at applications like Word, Excel, and Outlook, and I can generate statistics. This is very easy work. Again, I'm giving you a really solid recommendation for a new way to approach prioritizing your vulnerabilities by focusing on identifying those vulnerabilities that can lead to initial access and privilege escalation, so that you are focused on the attack cycle rather than just the severity of the vulnerability. Remember that severity codes are from the vendor telling you how bad that vulnerability can compromise their product. They have no knowledge of where this sits within your architecture. You have that knowledge. So this is a very basic analysis that you can do without having to spend a lot of money or time and effort, and it is extremely effective. Okay, so that was my challenge to you, to begin to really start digging into your vulnerability data and see if you don't start finding some real gold nuggets buried in there. Okay, I'm going to leave you here. Make sure you visit me at cyberriskmodels.com, because we have classes and workshops very specific to these topics, and I'll see you in the next episode.